Can we just be happy?
I don't know, Alice.
You'll never leave me, right?
Before we get any further, I just want to calm everyone's fears because this game has nothing to say and is definitely not about race.
Fuck if I know.
David Cage is emphatic that he doesn't want the game to have something to say.
They've been butchering each other for centuries over the color of their skin or whatever god they wanted to worship.
And he doesn't see himself as delivering a message to people.
Look at this little motherfucker. You steal our jobs, but you can't even stand up.
Detroit Become Human is a culmination of the writing and directing tropes from a French developer David Cage's other narrative-driven games, and it's a lot. I was never able to play Fahrenheit, but I had a lot of fond memories of Heavy Rain growing up, especially in an era before the infinitely better narrative-driven games like Until Dawn and some of Telltale's titles. And then came Beyond Two Souls, where some of the more pernicious aspects of Heavy Rain's narrative started really taking the forefront in its subtext before it just became the entire text of Detroit. Cage games are dark and gritty, in the same way all of the 15-year-old white boys who really loved the Joker and The Dark Knight and had just discovered Enlightenment philosophy that I was friends with in high school thought they were. That's to say that these games are often dark without a real narrative purpose. They're grim, violent, cynical, just in service of either shock value or to give the appearance that the games are serious and asking tough questions, when really they're just toying with the aesthetics of darkness. It's darkness for darkness' sake. Let's walk through some of his consistent themes before we really dig into what went wrong with Detroit. First, David Cage really likes to put his female characters in sexual danger. Madison from Heavy Rain, Jodie from Beyond, Kara from Detroit all find themselves in extremely gendered, violent situations. Madison's first appearance involves a home invasion, where she's repeatedly attacked and held down by masked attackers. Now, this doesn't have to inherently be portrayed as sexual danger in a game where all the main characters can get beat up and pinned down, but the existence of a shower scene right before this attack, the fact that she spends it running around in her underwear, and the way the scene is shot and framed make it clear this is a different kind of scene than, say, Ethan's post-shower scene where he's getting ready for the day, or Norman's fight with Mad Jack. And speaking of Mad Jack, don't worry, we'll get to the racism in his games in a bit. It's even worse than that this scene with Madison ultimately goes nowhere and has no importance to the plot. It serves only as a way to introduce Madison to the player by putting her in a dangerous situation. Later, she goes to a club to interview a suspect and she has to, you guessed it, strip tease for him at gunpoint as foreplay, because how else could a competent, driven journalist willing to lie and deceive get information from a subject in a compelling way to play if she's a woman? Jodie has a few of these scenes, but the worst is when she goes to a bar to hang out with her friends as a teenager. As soon as she stepped into that bar, I knew exactly where that scene was going because there's no other option for a David Cage game. She was going to be the victim of all of the men in the bar attempting to sexually assault her, and would need to fight her way out or be rescued. And I saw the signs immediately in my blind playthrough.
Now we're gonna get harassed by some man, and we're gonna need Aiden to help. Okay, how did I know this was gonna happen?
Some fucking spirit come to punish us for our sins.
Wow, way to be really explicit about this message. But it basically makes it so that, like, we don't get to think about sexual harassment and sexual assault as, like, things that normal men do that are shitty. Instead, it becomes, like, things that, like, clearly evil monsters do.
Again, the scene doesn't really lead anywhere in the long term. Its only tangential purpose is to punish her for breaking the rules and leaving the facility, or to show that she'll have to take care of herself. But several of the other scenes in the game do a much better job at this, and don't involve forcing her female protagonist into yet another sexually charged violent scene. And finally, Kara is the victim of domestic abuse, which again is portrayed as a cut and dry, this man was clearly a monster and everyone knows it situation. In reality, as Lundy Bancroft has written about, domestic abusers are often able to have very charming and lovable external lives that make it difficult for an abuse survivor's family and friends to believe them, and even sometimes make survivors question whether or not what they experienced was abuse. There is no pretense with Todd. Like the men in the bar in Beyond Two Souls, he is obviously abusive from the second you see him in the Cyberlife shop, and this paradoxically actually makes his abuse seem less scary than it should. When he's a Disney villain, the solution is just to kill or otherwise dispose of him, and that fixes the problem. But in real life, abusers, when they're legally powerful, as many abusers are in or have links to the police, when they're charming, when they're popular, escape also seems impossible. In each of these cases, the game has the easy argument of sexual harassment, assault, and abuse is wrong, but fails to substantively deal with these issues as structural gendered issues rather than interpersonal issues. And this, combined with the game's general disinterest in meaningfully and sensitively commenting on these problems, results in games that portray sexual violence as thrill and shock. It's a cheap emotional punch that's not meant to make you think seriously about these topics, but instead to serve as a backdrop of adrenaline-fueled QuickTime events. When you kill Jodie's harassers in the bar as Aiden, you're not saying anything about sexual harassment. You're living out a paternalist fantasy where you come in and save the day, rescuing a woman from those evil men who clearly couldn't possibly bear any similarities to you. It's functionally similar to white savior narratives, where it looks like the narrative cares about helping poor people of color, but in reality, the way it's framed and written, it's clear the actual audience is white people who want to feel good about not being racist. Which takes us to Cage's repeatedly bad representation of race in his games. Heavy Rain has a very white cast overall, and to be honest, I kind of wish it were all white, because the portrayal of characters like Mad Jack is a mess. You get people of color as convenience store owners, as sexual harassers, and criminals, but oh wait, it gets worse in Beyond Two Souls. Jodie works for the CIA and invades Somalia to assassinate a criminal warlord. This is already a bad setup, but it gets worse. So while she independently infiltrates and takes down a dozen armed guards without a gun, she runs into a child soldier who she manages to heal and win his trust. In a twist that shocked 0% of people familiar with Western stories like this, the child soldier actually ends up being the son of your target and shoots at you in the most boring and common way to reinforce the perceived danger and primitiveness of the global South. This is a really common trope, and it pops up especially in post-9/11 films to justify US invasion and war. It's the idea that you can't trust anyone, even pregnant women and children, so we really can't feel too bad if we indiscriminately bomb and shoot up civilians as collateral damage. Maybe they're all in on it. Jasbir Puar talks about this extending back into the West as well, where people racialized as Middle Eastern or Arab are thought of as secretly the enemies within, whose loyalty to the nation is suspect. This is the same kind of rhetoric that justified Japanese internment, the idea that we couldn't trust even US-born Japanese because they might secretly betray us. Now, like with the sexual violence, the game's thrown a lip service message that can seem progressive. In this case, it's the CIA invading Somalia is wrong because they're actually trying to overthrow a democratically elected president. But again, this doesn't go much farther. It doesn't become part of a larger commentary or critique of US imperialism. It hardly even extends to a larger critique of the CIA. And while she's upset at Ryan for manipulating her, he's still a viable romance option, and one that they try really, really, really hard to get you to end up with in the end. My Jodie literally chose death over Ryan because I spent the whole game saying no to his advances, but the narrative kept portraying this couple as the culmination of a long, serious romance. And Navajo. Just the entire Navajo chapter is saturated with ignorant tropes of indigenous peoples and culminates in a message of, maybe we shouldn't have been mad at the whites for genocide, because two wrongs don't make a right.
They were lost, full of hatred for the white man.
Oh my fucking god.
In spirit, to kill their enemies and gain revenge.
David Cage, why?
Turned against them.
Oh god, why? Why'd you gotta do this?
Hungry for blood, east.
Let's just fix colonialism and genocide by all getting along because they shouldn't be mad at the white man. Oh fuck.
Ignoring the larger thematic racism in Detroit, the portrayal of individual people of color in the newest game traffics in some uncomfortable historical tropes. The mammy, the silent Asian prostitute, the big scary black man, all of these problems, the seeming obsession with sexualized danger and violence, the racist portrayal of people of color, and boiling down complex structural social problems to interpersonal solutions of just condemning obvious monsters and not being mean to people who benefit from your own oppression, comes up in Detroit a lot. The major issue with Detroit is the use of androids as a metaphor for an oppressed class, without really thinking through how it will articulate with existing social hierarchies, and what the implications your message for real-world social movements are. The metaphor is clumsy, it draws from a broad array of different social movements without thinking through how to articulate them together, and seems to be designed more to look like it has something to say than to actually have a message that drives the narrative and mechanical decisions of the game. So the game threads together three different stories. one of which has virtually nothing to do with the other two, which becomes clear because it can end pretty much immediately. You have Marcus, who's an android who becomes the figurehead of an android rights movement, and whose owner is Carl, so Carl Marcus. You have Connor, who's an android police investigator who's trying to find and stop all deviants, who are androids who have rebelled from their programming. And you have Kara, who might as well not be in the larger story at all, but who has her own disconnected narrative where she's trying to escape to the north with her abusive owner's daughter. Through the three storylines, the player gets a taste of how android oppression manifests in Detroit. And it doesn't make sense. What exactly are the androids a metaphor for? The most obvious connection is race, and that seems to be the one the game leans into the most. You have your references to the slavery of black people in the US, the Underground Railroad, escaping to Canada for freedom, unabashed references to actual anti-racist slogans and movements like Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, slave songs,
Sing on just a little while longer.
Black Power symbols, characters named Luther and Rose, and contemporary Black Lives Matter slogans and symbols like I Can't Breathe, which is a reference to the 2014 police murder of Eric Garner, and Hands Up Don't Shoot, which is a reference to the 2014 Ferguson shooting of Michael Brown. These all seem to point to an interest in handling, albeit clumsily and tastelessly, the issue of racism. But not only is Cage explicitly uninterested in having anything to say about race in his game that is supposedly solely focused on the future of AI or automation, the game also barely mentions race. In an oppression metaphor of race, when your stand-ins also can be categorized into existing races, you can't not mention race. It undermines the theme of anti-racism if you have black androids, white androids, Asian androids, Latinx androids, etc., and you don't interrogate how this might play into an existing structural racism. Is there a racial pattern in the appearance of different android models that reflect the biases of the humans who created them? How did they choose what each model ought to look like? Are some more popular? Particularly for the models used as sex workers, substitute family members, or the perfect partner, like Eating Club models, Alice or North, are there a wide variety of diverse models, or is it more limited? Literally just stop to think for a second about eugenics when you have a model that's the perfect partner, and you're only shown one of them. Maybe the androids are a stand-in for immigrants and are meant to tell a story about anti-immigrant racism or xenophobia. After all, the protesters in the beginning beat up Marcus for supposedly taking their jobs, and this is one of the most consistent anti-android rhetoric lobbed at them throughout the game. But while it makes sense if you're racist to target immigrant workers, why is the anger in Detroit directed at the literal machines rather than the corporate Cyberlife, who appear to be the only company that's making androids and actually have a really disconcerting amount of influence in US society? It doesn't make sense for humans to be trying to intimidate machines if they don't see them as sentient. A week ago, my bike got a bad flat at the worst possible time, and I was frustrated at it and at needing to walk 2 hours to the bike shop, but I didn't, lean over and stare at it in its handlebars and whisper, "Hey, I'm talking to you, asshole. Be careful in the garage tonight. Bikes have a tendency of, getting themselves set on fire these days." And I know this seems like an unfair exaggeration of Detroit's writing, but
Be careful on your way back. Androids have a tendency of getting themselves set on fire these days.
even when Siri or Alexa, which are much more human than a bike, act up, people don't beat the shit out of it. It's expensive, and it's not sentient. The other issue with the metaphor of androids as immigrants in the US is that anti-immigrant rhetoric in the US has been focused not solely on perceived employment theft, which May Night deconstructs as a myth, but it's been a larger racialized hatred that's embedded in perceived entitlement to landed resources for whites. So, as Nye points out, the perception of widespread job competition of Filipino laborers was in fact fueled by long-standing racial animus towards Asiatics. The central element of this hostility was the ideology of white entitlement to the resources of the West. That outlook overdetermined race relations and created the problem, both real and imagined, of economic displacement. So in fact, much of anti-immigrant anxiety articulates most strongly in the realm of sex and family. It's the fear that people of color will become a majority in the US, that interracial marriage will slowly erase whites, and that whites will have fewer children that undergird the white supremacist myths of the Great Replacement or white genocide. The game could have potentially dealt with this if it explored the relationship between models like North and their human partners, or the societal reactions to android children. There honestly likely would be a fear that technically perfect android partners would break up human marriages and families, that humans might not birth many children anymore in lieu of building their perfect kids instead, and that could very easily lead to intense resentment and violence directed at androids, but that's not where the game is interested in going. Are they a metaphor for refugees? Kara's final boat sequence is eerily similar to instances of state violence against refugees, sometimes pejoratively called boat people, in different eras of history. This is especially true with the imagery of a dead child lying on the beach or drowning, which has been the subject of many famous photographs of refugee crises. But again, the metaphor doesn't work, because it's not Canada that's stopping the androids from coming, as is often the case with refugees in the real world. It is solely an oppressive, originary country that's causing the problem. There isn't a substantive critique or discussion of other nation-states like Canada refusing to take in android refugees and willing to let them die on the border or in refugee camps. There is some mention that Canada doesn't allow any androids to be built, but that doesn't seem to be a big concern for the androids. And worse, it undermines the game's racism theme. It's not that Canada is actually a place of liberation for the androids, as the North was mythologized to be during US slavery. It's just a space where they can hope to hide themselves more effectively. The concentration camps that are used on the androids don't cleanly map onto refugee camps either, because these are explicitly extermination camps, rather than the kind of genocide by neglect dynamic that refugee camps often model themselves after to hide their inhumanity behind bureaucracy. Are they a metaphor for Holocaust victims? The android uniforms they all must wear include bright armbands that mimic the armbands worn by Jewish, Romani, gay, disabled, and other concentration camp inhabitants, and the imagery of the triangle on these suits is reminiscent of the triangular symbols that were used to categorize different prisoners, such as red for political prisoners or pink for LGBTQ+ people. But then we'd have to have a serious conversation about nationalism and fascism in the metaphor, and it just doesn't exist. I hope by now you're starting to see the problem. The game deploys the most recognizable and emotionally salient aspects of a broad array of real-world social movements and tragedies to evoke the idea of a serious political commentary, but it has next to nothing to say about the subject, resulting in a tasteless mashup of the symbols of actual human genocide just for the aesthetics. Worse, what it actually has to say about social movements is dangerously simplistic. Detroit fetishizes nonviolence without thinking through how it has been used as a strategic tactic rather than a moral code, and how a strict adherence to nonviolence leads to actual loss of life for already marginalized communities. The game presents options through Marcus's storyline that result in a binary of raising public opinion through nonviolence or lowering public opinion through violence. In interviews, they've tried to claim this isn't a judgment, and both are viable options that are simply different in method and outcome. But the binary nature of this system, and the fact that it's tied to blue and red arrows typical of game morality systems, communicates how we are supposed to think of them. Nonviolence is good, and violence is bad. In this binary morality system, the lives of other android protesters are largely expendable, and at worst, are treated functionally as a kind of currency. If you let a few dozen get killed by the police, public opinion goes up, and that's good because nonviolence is the path that is framed as the least ambiguously good ending. So, who cares about them? We don't get to meet or learn about the interior lives of the androids whose lives are actually on the line. Josh and North are too important for the plot to really be in danger until the very end, and we learn so little about Simon and his point of view that his death lacks meaning. Heck, of the three, only North is really given enough to be a real character. The androids who follow Marcus largely say nothing and uncritically follow him immediately. When they die, it's sad in the way it is when Pikmin are killed. You may feel a guilt or regret for not leading them as effectively as you could, but ultimately it's a utilitarian sadness. And actually, Pikmin dying is probably more emotional because you're operating in a much wider possibility space. It's theoretically possible to not kill a single Pikmin, so an element of personal failure is always present, whereas in a narrative-driven game that's simply not a factor. No one's death or sacrifice has real human meaning because we don't know who they are and we don't really care. The danger of fetishizing nonviolence as the key to winning rights in any circumstances, because after all it takes only a few days of protest to win rights, is it ignores how nonviolence is defined by the state and media and then necessarily condemns real-life movements that are branded as violent. Black Lives Matter is a contemporary nonviolent social movement that's routinely framed as violent by politicians and news anchors, largely because blackness is often seen as threatening in the United States. Many Americans are perfectly willing to watch footage of unarmed black protesters being attacked or even killed by well-equipped police and argue that the protesters are at fault. We've even seen instances of cars driving into groups of Jewish protesters of ICE camps, framed as protesters' fault for peacefully protesting in the street. But Detroit is unwilling or unable to tackle this dynamic, so peaceful protest in Detroit is easy, it's fast, it's effective, and this ultimately frames violence as inherently immoral. When it's easy to just ask for and then receive rights, then fighting back against state violence looks like an ineffectual and hypocritical smokescreen for just wanting to hurt people. The truth is, many social movements framed as violent often started nonviolent and largely remain nonviolent, but police and state authorities continuing to not just ignore the messages behind protests, but worse, to attack, punish, or even kill protesters, understandably lead to more drastic and desperate actions. Woomera refugee camp protesters are famous for using tactics that were framed as inhumane or unthinkable, such as hunger strikes, rioting, ingesting poison, or even lip sewing, where participants sewed their lips together so they couldn't eat. These forms of protest draw attention to the inherent violence of refugee camp conditions because it begs the question of how desperate conditions must be for sewing your own lips to be a viable decision people would make. And these tactics are largely portrayed as disruptive, unthinkable, and violent. But by positioning a simplistic image of Gandhi or MLK Jr.-esque nonviolence as the optimal way forward and an easy way to resolve conflict, Detroit plays into the same type of narratives that allow for the dismissal of groups like Black Lives Matter or Palestinian resistance movements as violent and thus bad. It's the white liberals' understanding of civil rights movement, where MLK Jr.'s central message was, we have to love each other, and we ignore his letters from a Birmingham jail where he explicitly criticizes white moderates who care more about order or the appearance of peace over justice. Unlike human rights movements, there is very little at stake for the androids, and it shows. Death shouldn't be a big deal because we've seen androids repaired and come back to life, often with memory intact. Conversion to sentience is easy, so even a hard reboot isn't a problem. There's no need to eat or sleep, so material needs are few. They can't really be starved out. To be honest, Jericho is a perfectly adequate living space because they don't need comfort and don't feel cold or heat. All of the trappings of actual social movements that make them so difficult to win and that make state violence so inhumane don't come into play with the android metaphor. It makes no sense that in the ending where the androids go to war, they lose, because it's stated earlier in-game that 3/4 of the military are androids, and unlike human soldiers or police, androids don't need to rest and don't need supplies. The metaphor hasn't been thought through, and it leaves some bad implications when we look at real social movements. There's a lot more that I could say about Detroit. The writing is bad, the emotional moments don't pay off, the character arcs are really rushed, like all of a sudden Hank liked Connor. Maybe if you play the game exactly the way it's intended, the arcs are smoother, but that still points to bad writing when you have branching narrative paths. These issues, though, pale in comparison to the larger thematic problems. Heavy Rain still had many of these problems, but was a much stronger game overall because it largely stayed in a localized theme and didn't try to bite off more than it could chew in service of looking smart. I mean, it still did that, but much, much less. What I'm more interested in are all the missed opportunities and how the story could be told. Though, to be clear, I wouldn't want David Cage to be the one telling the story, even with all of these opportunities addressed. Androids would be an opportunity to reconceptualize death in interesting ways. When you're functionally immortal as an android, the primary thing that will kill you is mechanical failure and not being able to replace damaged parts that are theoretically designed and made by humans. How is death conceptualized by androids then, and how do they view humans knowing they are their creators? If maybe the closest analogy would be akin to humans rising up against God, that's an interesting dynamic to look into. Are there discrepancies between androids made for different professions? In the same way that we can see divides between marginalized racial groups that are the result of intentional wedges between them, or divides between, for instance, field and house enslaved peoples, do, say, android models in service work see their predicament in different ways or with different stakes than android models who work in offices? Is there a contingent of androids who are actually largely okay with the system of exploitation because they're in a relatively higher position in the hierarchy than other androids? In the US, poor whites have often been leveraged against poor people of color to prevent class solidarity by emphasizing the false consciousness that poor immigrants or people of color are the true enemy. Has that happened in androids? Is there space to more critically analyze the roles of leaders of social movements that take credit and seem pleased to taking power? Marcus mentions he likes the feeling that people are listening to and following him, and this goes uncritiqued. But we've seen through social movements that some leaders, particularly straight men, can be more invested in maintaining power over making sure other more vulnerable populations within a movement are protected or given credit. Even in the Black civil rights movement, we see the devaluation of Black women and Black LGBTQ+ people and the celebration of charismatic straight Black men. But this one especially can't come from David Cage, oh god, I'm so glad he didn't touch it. Finally, is there a way for a game on Android to deal more substantively with an anti-corporate message when it's already so close to doing so? CyberLife seems to control everything, but no one really questions it. And especially in a game which manages to avoid much of the anti-Asian racism and techno-orientalism that's often present in speculative fiction and cyberpunk, is there space to carve out an anti-corporate theme here that avoids those pitfalls? Detroit is disappointing. It's a poorly written game that really has nothing important to say behind its aesthetic choices that demand to be taken seriously, but it's also a natural outcome of Quantic Dream's larger body of work that prioritizes dramatic trauma porn and simplistic ideologies over substantively handling complex structural topics and themes, which, hey, in 2019, I guess that's the new thing in media now.
Tell them to stand down.